If you think people in the Middle Ages were sexually repressed, you're only half right, because medieval Europe was obsessed with sex, but not in the way you think. Doctors believed a woman could go insane just because she wasn't having enough of it. Priests told the sick that sleeping with the pure might heal them, and courts used public humiliation, forced confessions, and even rituals to control people's most private urges. This isn't some dark fairy tale. These were real practices, real beliefs, written into law, preached from pulpits, and passed down for centuries. Today, we're digging up 10 of the strangest, most disturbing sex-related ideas from medieval history. And number 7, it wasn't just illegal. It got entire animals executed. Welcome to Twisted Facts Vault. Subscribe if you dare. The virgin cure myth. In medieval Europe, illness was a mystery. Germs not discovered, hygiene optional. So when someone got sick, especially with symptoms of what we'd now recognize as STDs, they didn't turn to medicine. They turned to myth. One of the darkest beliefs, the so-called virgin cure. It was widely believed that if a person, especially a man, was suffering from a venereal disease, the quickest cure was to have intercourse with someone completely pure. A virgin. The younger, the better. Some thought the virgin's untouched body had healing properties. Others believed the bad blood would transfer out during the act. Disturbing. Yes. But it was taken seriously, especially by men in positions of power. It's important to be clear, there's no record of this being state-sponsored or officially endorsed by the church, but that didn't stop the belief from spreading. Across Europe, especially in urban centers like London, Paris, and Prague, cases emerged where men sought out purity as a form of treatment. The truth. These ideas not only failed to cure anything, they often made everything worse. This belief eventually evolved into a wider superstition, that proximity to virginity could cleanse illness, either spiritually or physically. And while it didn't always involve anything criminal, the underlying idea was always the same. Purity could fix impurity. Chastity belts, fact, fiction, and fear control. You've probably heard of chastity belts, those infamous metal underwear supposedly locked onto women to prevent sex while their husbands were away at war. For years, people believed they were a joke or a myth. Turns out, they were real. At least, in some cases. While some so-called chastity belts in museums were later proven to be hoaxes or Renaissance creations, historical records do show that versions of these devices existed in the late Middle Ages. Some were made of leather, others of iron, and a few even had spikes. But here's the twist. They weren't always used to enforce fidelity. Some were created under the guise of protection, to guard against assault during travel or invasion. Others were a cruel form of punishment or humiliation for women accused of being promiscuous. Even if they weren't widespread, the very idea of a device to control a woman's body says a lot about how medieval society viewed sex, power, and trust. And remember, this was a time when virginity was seen as a woman's only value. So locking it up? That made perfect, twisted sense. Hysteria and the wandering womb. Doctors in the Middle Ages didn't just believe in bad humors or bloodletting. They believed that a woman's uterus could literally travel around her body. They called it hysteria, from the Greek word for womb. If a woman was emotional, anxious, or unwell, physicians claimed her womb had become unmoored and was floating inside her like a balloon. This so-called wandering womb could cause everything from dizziness to madness. So what was the solution? You guessed it, sex. Doctors recommended marriage and intercourse as a cure, claiming it would lure the uterus back into place. In more extreme cases, they used aromatic herbs, oils, or even manual stimulation to coax the womb back home. Today, we'd call it junk science. Back then, it was standard medical advice, and women, they didn't get much say in the matter. Shame as punishment, sex offenders and public humiliation. Forget jail. In medieval times, if you broke the rules of sexual conduct, your punishment was public and humiliating. One of the most common punishments? The cucking stool, accused of cheating, prostitution, or sexual impropriety. You'd be tied to a chair and dunked in a river, sometimes repeatedly, while the townspeople laughed and threw rotten food. In other towns, you might be paraded through the streets wearing absurd costumes, animal masks, fake genitalia, or signs describing your crime. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about public control, turning private behavior into public spectacle, to scare others into obedience, and worse. These punishments were often handed down by all-male councils with no appeal. The Church and secret wives. The Catholic Church officially demanded celibacy from its priests, but in practice, things looked very different. In many towns, priests openly lived with women, sometimes even starting families. These women were called secret wives, even though everyone knew about them. And since the Church technically forbade marriage for clergy, these relationships had no legal protection. The women couldn't inherit property, and their children were often denied legitimacy. Some clergy went further, collecting bribes for indulgences while living in lavish homes with mistresses and children. The hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed, but it wasn't often punished, especially if the priest was well connected. In some cases, monasteries became known for scandal, with brothel-like reputations behind closed doors. So much for holy vows. Bestiality and the trial of animals. Yes, people in medieval Europe were put on trial for bestiality, but here's the part that's harder to believe. So were the animals. If someone was caught in an inappropriate act with an animal, both the human and the creature could be put on trial. Pigs, donkeys, and goats were dragged before judges and, if found guilty, they were executed. Publicly, sometimes the human would be hanged and the animal burned. In other cases, the animal was dressed in human clothes for the execution to mock the act. The logic? Sin infected everything it touched, even animals. It sounds absurd now, but at the time these rituals were deadly serious. In the eyes of the law, morality wasn't just about humans, it was about keeping God's entire creation clean. Masturbation and demons. In modern times, masturbation is a private act. In the Middle Ages, it was a full-blown spiritual emergency. Religious scholars believed that self-pleasure was an invitation to demons. If a man or woman gave in to temptation, they weren't just committing a sin, they were opening a portal. Monks wrote in grim detail about night terrors, demon visitations, and even physical illness caused by what they called impure touch. Some believed nocturnal emissions were signs that a person had been violated by an incubus or succubus, a sexual demon. To fight the temptation, some took extreme measures, fasting, flagellation, even self-castration. Yes, really, in some monasteries, monks who broke their vows were isolated, beaten, or expelled, all for something most modern cultures barely blink at. Trial by copulation. One of the most horrifying legal practices from the later medieval period involved accusations of rape or seduction. In some regions, if a man denied wrongdoing and the woman insisted something had happened, the court might propose a solution: reenact the encounter in public. The idea was that divine truth would reveal itself. If the man was lying, God would somehow expose him. If the woman was lying, she'd be humiliated into silence. Of course, this practice was rare, unofficial, and usually reserved for lower-class disputes. But the fact it ever existed at all is deeply disturbing. It shows just how little autonomy women had in medieval courts. Justice was a performance, and truth was up for debate. Witch hunts and the devil's mark. During the witch trials, women were frequently accused of having secret sexual relationships with demons. But how did inquisitors prove it? They searched their bodies for what they called the devil's mark, a hidden mole, scar, or extra nipple. If they found anything unusual, it was said to be where a demon or familiar had fed. Some went further, claiming witches had suckled the devil himself. Inquisitors often inspected these marks in deeply invasive and humiliating ways, sometimes using needles to see if the woman felt pain, other times forcing confessions under torture. It was a horrifying blend of sexual suspicion, superstition, and state-sanctioned abuse, and tens of thousands died because of it. Virginity tests and broken futures. For young women in the Middle Ages, virginity was currency. Before a wedding, some were inspected by midwives to prove their virginity. If they failed, the marriage could be cancelled, or worse, their families punished. These tests weren't scientific. They relied on myth, like whether a woman blushed, walked awkwardly, or had an intact hymen. But the consequences were real. In some places, if a bride was suspected of being impure, she could be returned to her family in shame. In others, she might be imprisoned or executed. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. And for many women, one private act, or even just a rumor, could destroy their future forever. The medieval world was obsessed with purity, but behind closed doors, it was a maze of contradictions, fears, and dangerous ideas. Sex wasn't private. It was political, it was spiritual, and sometimes it was deadly. If you want more disturbing truths from history, subscribe to Twisted Facts Vault. We dig up what others won't touch. And if you think this was bad, wait until you see what royalty did behind the throne.